In just 30 seconds in the first-class cabin, a black mother clutching her newborn screamed in despair as the flight attendant slapped her hard across the face and yelled horrific insults. But what made the villain tremble when a dark secret was exposed to millions? Amara Jones sat in the first-class cabin of the flight from Los Angeles to New York, holding her newborn son, Elijah. She couldn't stop gazing at him with a look full of worry and anticipation. Elijah, with his large round eyes like two bright jewels, lay quietly in her arms, occasionally letting out soft cries. Each cry filled Amara with an indescribable sense of fear, as though the eyes of the other passengers were tearing her apart. She knew others were staring at her with cold, unsympathetic glances. Everything around her seemed to fade into silence, leaving only the tiny sounds of her baby in her arms. The people sitting nearby seemed unable to tolerate not the baby's cries, but her presence, a young mother, a black woman, in the luxury of first class. A tall man dressed in an expensive shirt, arms crossed, kept glancing back at her. A woman across the aisle threw a disdainful look, as though Amara were an unwelcome intruder into their space. The feeling of not being wanted cut deep into her heart. She couldn't look at their faces, but the fear and embarrassment clung to her like an inescapable shadow. Elijah's cries grew louder. She tried to soothe him, but the helplessness of not being able to calm her child made her feel smaller and smaller. Each cry struck like a blow to her already fragile confidence. She tried to smile, but it only made the cold stares around her even more piercing. Amara could clearly feel the discrimination, the coldness, and a profound loneliness. The light in the cabin seemed to suffocate her even more. The luxurious seats, the lavishly decorated walls, all of it was a painting that didn't belong with her presence. How could she sit among these rich, successful people when she was just a black woman, poor, with a newborn and an overwhelming fear for the future? Amara took a deep breath, but the trembling in her hands wouldn't subside. She felt an overwhelming loneliness. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such discrimination, but this time it felt heavier than ever. She could feel the distance in every glance, in every whispered word among the passengers. In a brief moment, Amara looked into her son's eyes. Those bright, innocent, and naive eyes reminded her that love still existed in this world, that there was still hope, no matter how harsh the world around them was. But immediately, she felt the weight of pressure bearing down on her. What was she supposed to do to protect her son? How would Elijah grow up in a world like this? The confusion about the future made her heart race. The gaze of another passenger seemed to pierce through her, a look of judgment that she could no longer bear. She turned away, unwilling to face anyone else. Their gazes, that subtle discrimination, felt like an invisible wall surrounding her. This tension made Amara feel even more alienated from the world around her. The people around her probably didn't realize that with each cry of Elijah, with each cold look, she felt as though she was being suffocated. Every passing moment felt like a moment of despair. Yet no one in the cabin could perceive the silent suffering she was enduring. Amara's loneliness came not only from the distance of those around her, but also from the worry gnawing at her heart. She feared not just for Elijah's safety, but also for the possibility of being forever trapped in the shell of discrimination, unable to break free. Under the cold light of the airplane, among unfamiliar faces, Amara felt like a grain of sand in an endless desert, small, weak, and hopeless. She silently screamed in despair, but no one could hear that cry, even though it echoed in the depths of her heart. Amara had only just started to regain control over her emotions when the cold, piercing stares from the passengers around her began to close in once again. Her heart raced, anxiety flooding her chest as she felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The sound of footsteps approached, each step heavy with purpose. Then, a tall, imposing figure emerged before her. Claire Ramsey, the flight attendant. Her face adorned with a fake, almost mocking smile, yet the hatred in her eyes was unmistakable. Claire's gaze wasn't one of understanding or empathy, but of judgment. A cold, cutting look that seemed to penetrate directly to Amara's soul. Amara felt a deep sense of dread course through her as Claire drew closer, each step echoing in her ears like the ticking of a clock. She wanted to stand her ground, but the tremor in her hands and the rapid beating of her heart betrayed her. She could feel the sweat on her palms as her grip on Elijah tightened. Her eyes locked onto Claire's face, desperately bracing herself for the worst. Claire's eyes flicked down to the baby in her arms, then back to Amara. And in that brief glance, Amara could see the disgust, the disdain, an invisible barrier that no amount of courage could shatter. Claire stopped directly in front of her, towering over her with an air of superiority. Amara's chest tightened as she fought to stay composed, her voice trapped in her throat, her body frozen as the flight attendant's presence loomed over her like a storm cloud ready to strike. Then, in a moment so sudden it took Amara's breath away, the slap came. The violence of it seemed to shake the very air, a thunderous crack that broke through the tension of the cabin. The force of Claire's hand against her cheek was so brutal that it felt as though time itself had slowed. The sting was unbearable, hot, sharp, and searing. It was more than just the physical pain. It was the crushing weight of humiliation, the burning shame that scorched Amara's face, making her skin throb with the aftershock of the impact. The sound of the slap echoed in the stunned silence of the cabin, reverberating in Amara's ears as she blinked back tears. She could feel the heat from her cheek radiating out in waves, but it was the sting of Claire's words that truly cut through her. "You don't belong here," Claire spat, her voice dripping with venom, each word slicing through the air like a blade. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration, a proclamation of dominance, a reminder of her place in the world, and it crushed Amara's spirit. The words hit harder than the slap, sinking deep into her chest, lodging there like a painful truth she could never escape. Amara's hands trembled violently as she clutched Elijah to her, feeling the fragile weight of her newborn against her chest. She could feel the tears welling up, not just from the sting of the slap, but from the unbearable pain of being rejected, of being treated as less than human. The shame in her heart burned brighter than any physical wound. She wanted to scream, to shout out in defiance, but the words wouldn't come. The silence around her was deafening, the eyes of the passengers locking her in place like a trap, none of them offering even the smallest gesture of support. The cabin remained eerily still. Not a single soul dared to speak up. The icy glares from the passengers felt like daggers, each one a reminder that she was nothing more than an invisible presence, unwelcome and unwanted. Not one person spoke out against Claire's cruelty. They simply looked away, as if pretending nothing had happened was easier than confronting the ugliness of what they had just witnessed. It was as if Amara's pain was irrelevant, her dignity unworthy of protection. The world outside her seemed to move on, leaving her trapped in this moment, isolated and powerless. Amara's breath came in shallow gasps as her heart pounded in her chest, her throat tightening with a mix of fury and despair. The slap had shattered something deep within her, something fragile and precious. Her sense of hope, her belief in the kindness of others. She wanted to rage against the injustice, to demand an explanation, to make someone, anyone, see her, to make them understand the hurt that had been inflicted upon her. But all that came out was a choked sob. Her tears fell freely now, but they weren't just for the pain on her face. They were for the cruelty of the world that had led her to this moment, the world that saw her as less than everyone else in that cabin. "You don't belong here. You don't deserve to sit among people like me." Claire's voice cut through again, each word a sharp wound. The contempt in her voice rang louder than any slap ever could. Amara's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white as she tried to hold herself together for Elijah, but every fiber of her being screamed for release. The truth was too much to bear. This was a fight she couldn't win. This world had already decided her place. She was nothing in their eyes. With each passing moment, the weight of the slap and the hateful words grew heavier. Amara felt like she was drowning in the suffocating silence that had enveloped her, and the look of superiority on Claire's face was like an anchor pulling her deeper. She couldn't look at her anymore. She couldn't bear the sight of this woman standing there as though she had the right to demean her, to strip her of her humanity. The faces around her were all the same, cold, indifferent, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just been publicly humiliated. In that moment, Amara knew she was completely alone. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. No one was going to help her. No one was going to stand up for her. The slap had stolen something from her that she would never get back: her dignity, her sense of self-worth, and worst of all, the feeling that she would never be seen as equal in this world. As she clutched Elijah tighter, her chest tight with the weight of everything she had endured, Amara's tears kept falling. They weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of sorrow for a world that would never change, for a world that would continue to look at her son, and see nothing but a threat, a burden, a reminder of all the things they feared and rejected. She had been slapped not just by Claire, but by society itself, a society that saw her as less, that would never let her forget her place. And in the silence that followed, Amara realized the slap wasn't just an assault on her face. It was an assault on her very existence. The entire cabin was suffocating in the heavy silence following the brutal slap. Amara's face was still flushed red, her tears flowing relentlessly, soaking into her skin like wounds that couldn't heal. Every gaze in the cabin was fixed on her, but not with sympathy, only with coldness and indifference, as if she were an intruder who had no business being there. Amara held Elijah tightly in her arms, fighting to suppress the sobs that threatened to overtake her, but she couldn't shake off the overwhelming feeling of dread. Then, suddenly, a loud noise shattered the stillness, shifting the air in the cabin. From the back row, a powerful figure strode forward, his eyes blazing with fire, his hands clenched into fists. Mark Ellison, Amara's husband, stood up from his seat, tall and muscular, with a cold yet commanding presence. Mark's appearance immediately redirected every gaze in the cabin. "Don't touch my wife." Mark's voice rang out, deep and firm, demanding obedience. The entire cabin fell silent, as though time itself had stopped. Everyone seemed frozen, caught in the magnetic intensity of his presence, his eyes burning like flames, locked onto Claire, the flight attendant who had so ruthlessly attacked his wife. No one dared respond. The only sound was the forceful thud of Mark's footsteps growing louder as he walked toward Amara. He paid no attention to the shocked looks of the passengers surrounding him. All that mattered now was his wife, his family. Nothing else mattered in that moment. As he neared, without hesitation, he reached out and pulled Amara into his embrace, enveloping the trembling woman in his arms, the woman who had endured such humiliation and had no way of defending herself. The warmth of his body against hers was a lifeline, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Amara couldn't help but choke back the sobs rising from within. She looked up at him, searching his eyes for a flicker of hope in the midst of her despair. Though tears still streamed down her cheeks, the tightness of his hug provided a sense of fleeting peace amidst the storm. But that peace was only temporary, as the pain and anger still churned within her. Mark's gaze never wavered from Claire, his eyes seething with fury. "You're suspended immediately," he shouted, his voice breaking, tight with tension, as if a string was being pulled so taut that it could snap at any moment. Claire didn't dare to protest, her face stiffened with fear. The passengers around them were unsure of how to react. All eyes were now on the two of them, yet no one dared to speak. Only the suffocating tension in the air remained, thick enough to explode at any moment. Amara remained in Mark's arms, feeling his strength as her only source of protection. But deep inside, she still felt the wound, the one that couldn't be healed so easily. What could Mark do to erase the scars in her heart? What could she do to never have to endure that humiliation again? Her emotions in that moment were impossible to put into words. Part of her felt a sliver of hope because Mark was there, but it was entangled with a suffocating sense of despair. Could she ever live in a world so saturated with racism and discrimination? The question swirled endlessly in her mind. But right now, Mark's embrace was the only place she could turn for solace. Just when Amara thought the weight of the world might ease, another storm raged against her. No sooner had the shock of the slap faded than the vicious winds of betrayal swept in. A fake video, carefully edited to manipulate the truth, began to spread like wildfire across social media. Claire, not willing to let her cruelty fade into obscurity, used her influence to twist the narrative, turning the reality of what had happened into a twisted fiction. The video, doctored with precision, showed Amara supposedly attacking Claire first, artfully cropped and manipulated footage that painted a false picture. Even though the truth had been buried under layers of deceit, the video still packed a punch powerful enough to shock the world. The public's reaction was immediate and explosive, like a preordained script. Racist comments flooded social media platforms, pouring out from thousands of people who knew nothing about the real story but were quick to fall into Claire's trap. The cruelty of it all was overwhelming. "She deserves to be punished," one comment declared. Only one of many hateful words hurled her way. Amara was painted as the villain, her humanity stripped away, her dignity trampled underfoot by the unchecked cruelty of those who had no idea who she really was. Amara sat alone in a small, dimly lit room, the faint glow from her phone screen casting an eerie light over her tear-streaked face. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, were fixed on the screen where thousands of furious, venomous comments scrolled past, each one sharper than the last. The hate-filled words felt like daggers piercing her heart. She could hardly breathe as the comments overwhelmed her, suffocating what little hope she had left. She stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what was happening. How could a mother, just a woman trying to live her life, be treated this way? How could someone like her, simply because of the color of her skin, be turned into a monster by a lie? How could this happen? No, this can't be real, Amara whispered in disbelief, her voice trembling with confusion and shock. She tossed the phone down onto the bed in frustration, but she couldn't stop the thoughts from swirling in her mind like a whirlpool, pulling her deeper into despair. They didn't know her. They didn't know about the hours she had spent nursing her son through sleepless nights, about the struggles she faced each day simply to survive. They didn't see the pain, the fear, the quiet desperation that had been her constant companion. No, they saw her as something else, something monstrous, because that's what Claire had painted for them. Anger, raw and uncontrollable, bubbled inside her, threatening to boil over. Justice, once a guiding light, now seemed like a distant memory, twisted beyond recognition. There was nothing left to hold on to. She had always believed in the goodness of people, in the power of truth. But now, every belief, every ideal she had cherished, was being torn apart piece by piece. What had happened to her was not just a personal attack. It was an attack on everything she stood for, on every hope she had ever dared to nurture. The truth no longer mattered. The truth, that small, fragile thing, had been crushed beneath the weight of lies. What was left for Amara to do? She had no voice in this battle. She had no rights, no defenses, for the world had already judged her, branded her as guilty, and the world wasn't listening. They saw only the distorted version of her, the image Claire had crafted for them, a dangerous, angry woman who deserved nothing but condemnation. Every attempt she made to rise above it, to correct the lies, was met with more force, more weight pushing her down. She was crushed beneath the lies that were now widely accepted as truth. The people around her didn't see her, the real her. They saw only the version Claire had put on display, the image of a woman who had done something unforgivable, something unthinkable. The weight of their judgment, their cold indifference, felt like chains that bound her, leaving her powerless. Amara's tears flowed freely. But what could they solve? Her sobs were a silent plea for help, but they went unheard. She held Elijah close, his small form pressed to her chest, as if he were her only anchor in this storm. But even his presence couldn't erase the crushing weight of what she was experiencing. She clung to him desperately, hoping that somehow his innocent presence would shield her from the storm of hatred raging against her. But it felt like the world had turned its back on her, and she was left fighting alone against an overwhelming tide of cruelty and injustice. Her mind swirled with questions, but none of them had answers. How could a system, a society so determined to tear her down, ever be defeated? How could she survive in a world that had already decided her fate based on nothing more than lies and racial prejudice? She had thought she could rise above it, that truth would prevail. But now, all that seemed like foolish hope. The video had not just stolen her dignity, it had stolen her voice. She was no longer a person to them. She was a scapegoat, a figure to be blamed for things that had never happened. The lie had taken on a life of its own, and she was helpless in its wake. Amara closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, but the emotions inside her were a tempest, a storm of rage, fear, and helplessness. The weight of it was unbearable, and for a brief moment, She thought about giving up, letting it all go. She thought about letting the waves of despair pull her under. But then, in the darkness of her mind, Elijah's face appeared. His bright eyes, full of trust, full of life. His small, fragile body, still so dependent on her, reminded her that she couldn't quit. She had to fight for him, for the future. But she didn't know how. Not in a world that had turned its back on her. Not in a world that was so quick to condemn her for something she didn't do. The lie had already taken root, and she didn't know if she would ever be able to undo the damage. In that moment, Amara knew one thing with certainty. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how many truths she shouted into the world, it would never be enough. The battle was already lost. And yet, even in her despair, she found herself holding on to one fragile hope. The hope that somehow, someway, justice would prevail. But for now, she could only scream into the void, knowing that no one would hear her. The next morning, the pounding on the door came like the echo of fate itself. Amara sat by the window, her eyes still red from a sleepless night, her mind a fog that refused to clear. The comments on social media still haunted her, each hateful word a knife carving deeper into her already shattered heart. It felt as though the world had turned its back on her. And in that moment, she could hardly see any way out, no place to escape. The knock came again, this time louder, more forceful, followed by a cold voice from outside the door shouting, "Open up. We have a warrant." Amara jumped in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. But her body was frozen, unable to move. She knew what was coming. The shadow of injustice loomed over her, waiting to consume everything. When the door swung open, a team of police officers stood outside, their faces as cold and emotionless as stone. They were not here to protect her. They were here to strip her of everything she held dear, to take away her most precious possession. One of them stepped forward, holding up a piece of paper and announcing, "Amara Jones, by order of the court, you are being stripped of your parental rights due to legal violations and concerns for the safety of your child. We are taking your son." Amara couldn't believe her eyes. Everything was happening so fast. The officers stormed in, grabbing her roughly, and within seconds, they slapped handcuffs on her. It felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Meanwhile, Elijah, her beloved son, stood in the corner of the room, his large, tear-filled eyes wide with fear as he screamed in desperate agony. His cries tore through Amara's heart, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. She tried to run to him, but the officers yanked her back, dragging her out of the room like a criminal. "No, Elijah, I love you. I'm sorry, baby. I love you," Amara screamed, reaching out with all her strength. But the officers held her back. She could do nothing but watch her son sobbing uncontrollably, his tiny body racked with panic. It felt as if the world around her had crumbled, and a part of her soul was being ripped away with each step they took. Mark, her husband, rushed forward, his face pale with panic and rage. "Stop! You have no right to do this," he shouted, his voice cracking with anguish. He tried to move towards Amara, but the officers were too powerful, and he was shoved back. There was no way to stop them. The hopeless look in Mark's eyes mirrored his helplessness in the face of the ruthless force of the law. Amara could feel the pain of this separation, sharp and cruel. She wasn't just losing custody of her son, she was losing everything she held dear. In that moment, as they dragged her away, all she could do was stare at Elijah's frightened eyes. She screamed, her voice echoing through the silence of the house. But no one could save her. Her eyes pleaded silently to Mark, but he could only stand there, powerless. She felt as though a piece of her soul was breaking apart. The image of her and Elijah being torn apart would haunt her forever. How could she live in a world where the people she loved most were ripped from her so cruelly, with no justice, no mercy? As Amara was pulled out of the house, the pain, the helplessness, and the fury consumed her. Each step she was forced to take felt like a fresh wound being opened in her heart. The agony of having her right to be a mother taken away was unbearable, too immense for her to endure. Each moment felt like the end of her world, like everything she had ever known, loved, and fought for was slipping through her fingers. The prison was cold, the gray brick walls and heavy iron bars forming a suffocating space that crushed every ounce of life. Amara sat huddled in the corner of her dimly lit cell. The flickering light from a hanging bulb cast long shadows that only deepened the darkness. The clanging of the steel doors slamming shut echoed through the oppressive silence. The footsteps of the guards passing by were like the relentless gears of a cruel machine, never stopping. She had no idea how long she would be trapped in this hell, where justice had been buried and the screams of the innocent were never heard. The biting cold seemed to penetrate her skin. But it was not just the chill. It was the desperation wrapping its cold fingers around her heart with every passing day. Just yesterday, she had held her son in her arms, dreaming of a peaceful life. Now, all that was left was emptiness, wounds in her soul that could never heal in a world that had turned its back on her. Then, without warning, the cell door was yanked open. The heavy footsteps of the guards echoed as they entered, and Amara's body tensed in fear. But it was the sight of the other prisoners that truly froze her. They were the ones Claire had bribed, their eyes filled with hatred and malice. Without a word, just a cold glance, Amara knew exactly what she would be facing. Brutal punches landed on her body without mercy. Before Amara could even process what was happening, the pain exploded through her, a sharp agony that seemed to tear her apart. A punch to her stomach sent her crashing to the cold floor. Her breath caught in her chest. Blood began to trickle from her mouth and nose, staining the cold, gray tiles beneath her. Every blow felt like it was shredding her flesh. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing sense of helplessness. No one came to help. No one stood up to defend her. She screamed in desperation, trying to protect herself. But the harder she fought, the more intense the blows became. She could hear the mocking laughter of the other prisoners around her, their cruel jeers echoing in her ears. The guards stood by, silent, doing nothing to intervene. This was the price she had to pay for a distorted truth, for daring to stand up against injustice. Amara struggled to push herself up, her hands trembling and covered in blood. But before she could even gain her footing, a strong kick to her chest sent her crashing back down. She could feel the paralysis of pain coursing through her entire body. But the ache wasn't just from her physical wounds. The pain was a harsh reminder of everything she had lost, of how justice had been twisted and discarded. People like you don't deserve to live in this world. One of the prisoners spat, her voice thick with venom, before landing another punch to Amara's face. Amara couldn't respond. She couldn't fight back. All she could do was let the blood pour from her body. Her screams drowned in the silence of the prison. The bruises on her body weren't just signs of physical brutality. They were marks of injustice, of a world where the weak were always the ones to suffer. Amara felt invisible, worthless, treated with cruelty, and without a single person to stand up for her. Each punch, each hateful word, was a reminder of the world she had been forced into, a world where truth, justice, and compassion had been lost. As she lay there, blood spreading across the cold floor, Amara felt like she was dying. Not just physically, but spiritually. The world had abandoned her, stripped her of her right to live as an equal. Despair surged within her, a monstrous wave that washed away any remaining hope. All she had left was the crushing weight of her own broken soul and the painful realization that in this world, nothing was ever fair. Amara sat curled up in the dark corner of her prison cell, her body aching, her soul shattered. Each night passed in a haze, with wounds that never healed and a pain so deep it was impossible to describe. She had endured everything, but with each passing day, the desperation grew like an uncontrollable fire that couldn't be put out. She once thought she had hit rock bottom, but what happened next would push her into an even deeper abyss. That day, everything unfolded too quickly, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. When the guards entered her cell, Amara looked up at them through tear-filled eyes, confused, unsure of what was happening. One of the guards, a man in the prison uniform, opened the door and stepped in with a stern expression. "Search," he commanded. The cell went dead silent, save for the sound of footsteps and the clanking of chains. Amara had no idea what was happening, but she knew better than to resist. She understood that fighting back would only make things worse. The guard rummaged through all her belongings, his rough hands brushing across Amara's personal items. But when his hand touched her coat, something fell out. A small plastic packet filled with drugs, carefully hidden in the fabric. Amara's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. What is this? The guard's voice was cold, suspicious, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the package. I don't know. I didn't do anything wrong. Amara cried out in panic, tears mixing with the blood dripping from the wounds on her face. She tried to reach out as if to prove her innocence, but all she received was a cold, disdainful look from the guard. You know as well as I do this can't be a coincidence. Come with me, the guard said, not giving Amara a chance to explain herself. With a ruthless grip, he dragged her out of the cell, his steps commanding and merciless. In that moment, everything seemed to shatter inside Amara. She was thrown into an interrogation room, the harsh neon lights blinding her as they shone down on a face full of guilt she never committed. Her body trembled as if she were being torn from reality itself. She screamed in desperation, trying to explain, but no one listened. No, I didn't do anything wrong. Amara screamed, her words echoing in the room but falling on deaf ears. She looked at the indifferent faces of the interrogators, feeling the weight of isolation, the crushing sense of helplessness. The drug packet was planted evidence. Someone had set her up to destroy her. She knew this, but there was no way to prove it. There was no one here to help her. When the court session ended, she heard the words she never thought she'd hear. Life sentence. Everything collapsed around her. Her heart shattered into pieces. A mother, a wife, now trapped in the whirlpool of injustice with no escape. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. She had lost everything. Her son, her husband, and now her freedom. All Amara had left was a single thought, a cry from deep within, but no one could hear it. I didn't do anything wrong. In that moment, the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness consumed her completely. Everything was taken from her, and she was pushed into a trap she could never escape. The injustice, the deceit, the unbearable pain left her unable to stand. The pain never left Amara. It surged through her like crashing waves against her heart. In the dark night of the prison, with no one but her and the unhealed wounds, everything felt like it was slipping away. Despair enveloped her like an inescapable shadow. The world outside kept spinning, but within these walls, every ounce of hope seemed dead. Amara sat leaning against the cold, damp wall, her eyes red from endless tears, exhaustion making it impossible for her to cry anymore. She had lived through long nights filled with both physical and emotional torment. And now, all that remained was the feeling of emptiness. Everything had been taken from her, and with every weak breath, she felt herself sinking deeper into despair. Then, in a moment of silence, something shifted. A presence beside her. An older woman, Lena, approached and sat down next to Amara. She didn't say a word, but simply looked at Amara's wounds, then quietly pulled out a small medical kit. Lena's hair was graying, and her skin was wrinkled, but there was strength in her eyes, a quiet gentleness that spoke of years of hardship and survival. Amara looked at the woman, her eyes filled with doubt and exhaustion. You don't have to do this, Amara whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. Lena didn't respond right away, instead slowly tending to Amara's wounds. Her hands were gentle, deliberate, and filled with care, as though she wanted to ease Amara's pain, not just physically but emotionally as well. When the bandages were applied, Lena looked up, her eyes meeting Amara's with deep understanding. I know you're innocent, Lena whispered, her voice low but powerful. The words struck Amara like a flash of light in the darkness, cutting through the gloom in her heart. She had never thought anyone in this prison would believe her. But Lena, in her quiet way, offered her something precious, a sliver of hope. Amara couldn't contain her emotions anymore. She screamed in despair, recounting everything, the story of what had happened, the pain she had endured. Tears flooded her face, not from the physical pain, but from the unchangeable injustice, from the truth buried so deep. I didn't do anything wrong. No one believes me. Why are they doing this to me? Amara screamed, the pain crashing over her like a tidal wave, sweeping away every last shred of trust she had left. Lena sat silently, her gaze unwavering as she listened. After a while, she spoke again. I know, but I also know you are stronger than anyone here, Lena said, her voice gentle yet resolute. The truth will eventually come to light. You must be resilient. Those words, those soft yet powerful reassurances, were like a balm for Amara's broken spirit. She looked at Lena, feeling something inside her begin to settle, even if just for a moment. Though the pain in her heart still raged, at least now she didn't feel so alone in the world. Lena, a woman who had weathered countless trials and suffering, was the first person to offer her the gift of belief in humanity again. Amara didn't know if she could survive the dark days ahead. But in this moment, as Lena's compassionate eyes met hers, she felt a faint glimmer of light. Perhaps this world wasn't perfect, but at least there were still people like Lena, those who kept faith and kindness even when everything else seemed to be lost. The pain still lingered, but Lena's words gave Amara a spark of hope. Though the road ahead was long and filled with obstacles, at least she no longer felt like she was walking it alone. In the darkness of the prison, Amara and Lena sat close together. The dim light from the wall-mounted lamp barely illuminated the small space around them. The cold brick walls and suffocating air felt like a prison for her very soul. Yet amidst all that cold, a small flicker of hope began to emerge. Lena had shared her story with Amara. She was not just an elderly woman who had endured countless hardships in her life, but also a hacker who had once manipulated systems, breached important data, and now she was using those very skills to help Amara fight back against the injustice that had been done to her. "We can do this," Lena said, her eyes sharp and determined. "I can hack into the prison's security systems, access social media, and live stream the truth to the outside world. The whole world will know what really happened to you." Amara couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her entire life had been crushed in silence. But now, an opportunity had appeared, a chance for her to prove her innocence, to expose the injustice that had trapped her here. What Lena was saying was the only opportunity for the truth to be revealed. And though danger loomed ahead, Amara knew this was her only path to justice. But with the hope, fear began to creep in. Amara trembled, her hands clenched into fists. She thought of Elijah, the son she had been torn away from. "My son, if I don't escape, if I can't prove I'm innocent, will he grow up without me? Will I ever see him again?" Amara screamed in desperation, the fear of a mother nearly overwhelming her. "I can't live not knowing where my son is, if he's safe or not." Lena listened in silence, not interrupting, her gaze filled with understanding. Lena knew that the pain of a mother was beyond words, and she understood that it was love for her child that would give Amara the strength to face the challenges ahead. Then Lena's eyes shifted, a spark of hope shining through. "You've overcome so much in your life, Amara. You can do this. Your son will need your courage to live in a fair world. You can't give up now. This is our only chance to fight." The anger in Amara's heart slowly transformed into a new resolve. The beatings, the insults, the cruelty she had endured would no longer control her. That pain would become the fuel for her fight. She would no longer allow the evil around her to win, and she wouldn't let the truth be buried forever. "Yes," Amara said, her voice choking but firm with determination. "We'll do this. I won't let them win. I won't let this injustice crush me any longer. I will fight to the end for my son, for everything I've lost." The feeling of anger turned into resolve, and determination began to sprout in Amara's heart. Though the battle ahead would be filled with challenges, she knew there was no other choice but to fight. This was not just her battle. It was the battle for all those oppressed, all those trampled by a brutal and unjust system. Lena began preparing the plan, opening documents, analyzing weaknesses in the prison security system. Amara sat beside her, focused on every detail. She was not only facing the physical wounds on her body, but she was also braving the immense challenges ahead to expose the truth. But now, she no longer felt alone. The light of hope had flickered in her heart, and her determination to fight back had burned stronger than ever. The night in the prison was eerily quiet, the darkness suffocating every corner of the cell, with only the heavy breathing of the inmates filling the silence. Amara lay on her bed, her eyes wide open yet unable to sleep. She could feel the danger creeping closer, like a storm ready to strike. Despite Lena's efforts to give her a flicker of hope, a deadly threat still hung over her head like a sword waiting to fall. The silence grew heavier when a soft step echoed from the door. No one in the room noticed until a figure slipped in through the back entrance. Hired by Claire, the assassin moved like a ghost. His face was concealed behind a black mask, and in his hand, he carried a gleaming knife, the blade cold and ruthless. much like the death he was bringing. Amara remained unaware of the imminent danger until the assassin stopped right beside her bed. The sensation of someone watching her woke her up with a start, but by the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. Before she could scream, the man moved swiftly, the knife flashing in the dim light like a bolt of lightning tearing through the stillness. "You won't survive tonight." His voice was cold and emotionless. The blade was pressed against her throat, and Amara could feel the icy steel against her skin. The scent of blood already thickening the air. Her heart raced. Panic surged within her, but she couldn't move, couldn't escape. In that split second, all her hopes seemed to shatter. Death stood right in front of her, and there was no one to save her. Everything around her went silent, leaving only the sound of her labored breath, her mind screaming in terror. Then, a noise shattered the stillness. Lena, her prison friend, had seen it all. She leapt from her bed, letting out a primal roar, not caring about the danger. "No!" she shouted, rushing to shield Amara from the assassin. Lena didn't hesitate, didn't think about her own life. She threw herself in front of Amara, using her own body as a shield. But she couldn't escape the assassin's blade. Lena's body twisted as the knife drove deep into her stomach. Blood poured from the wound, and Lena staggered back, collapsing onto the floor, her face pale from the blood loss. "Lena!" Amara screamed in panic, her voice echoing through the darkness. But no one came to help. The situation turned even worse when the assassin stepped back, looking down at Lena with contempt. "You can't save her," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, as if Lena's life wasn't worth a second thought. "Death is the fate of someone like you." Amara, her heart in agony, dropped to her knees beside Lena, but she had no idea what to do. She screamed in desperation as she saw the deep wound in Lena's body. "You can't die. You can't leave me." Amara cried out, her hands trembling as she clutched Lena, the blood from the wounds soaking her hands, her heart breaking in the process. But Lena only gazed at her with a gentle look, as if to remind her that she couldn't give up. No matter how much pain she was in, Lena's gaze remained strong, as though she didn't want Amara to see her falter. I won't leave you," Lena whispered, her words weak but carrying a profound strength. Lena couldn't speak anymore, but Amara knew deep down that Lena's sacrifice was the beginning of their fight back. Even in this moment, as evil attacked her from all sides, Amara understood that she couldn't give up. She couldn't let cruelty win. She had to survive, to fight for the truth, to live for Lena and all they had endured together. With each passing second, Amara's heart felt as though it were being torn apart. But in the depths of her despair, a spark of determination began to flicker within her, and she knew that despite everything, she would never surrender. Lena's blood spread across the cold prison floor, staining the gray tiles in a crimson pool. Yet, in that life and death moment, everything seemed to fade into the background. Amara could no longer feel the pain from her own wounds. All that remained was a dizzying sensation, as if she were trapped in an endless nightmare. Lena, the only friend who had given her hope, lay in a pool of her own blood, unable to move. Each drop of Lena's blood seeped into the ground, and Amara, her heart shattering into pieces, couldn't hold back the tears. But as she looked into Lena's sacrificial face, she knew that she couldn't give up. She couldn't let evil and cruelty win. Lena had sacrificed herself to protect her, and now Amara understood that she had to do something to honor that sacrifice. In that moment of life and death, with the assassin still standing there, sneering at their pain, Amara knew there was no choice left. She turned, her hands shaking but determined not to back down. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the phone Lena had helped her hide, the one she had planned to use when the time came. Amara fumbled to turn on the live stream, her fingers trembling as if the entire world had narrowed down to just her and the looming presence of death. But then the screen flickered to life. Millions of people from all around the world began to see Amara, and she could feel their eyes on her. With each passing second, her breath grew heavier, but she knew she couldn't stop. "I've been framed," Amara screamed, her voice cracking in agony. "Claire wants me dead. I didn't do anything wrong." Every word she spoke felt like a desperate plea for salvation, a call for justice for herself and for the innocent. Lena's blood still soaked the floor, but Amara was no longer afraid. She had made up her mind. This was her one chance to reveal the truth. Lena's blood stained Amara's hands, but as she stared into the camera, her gaze became resolute. She screamed the truth for one reason alone: to make sure everyone watching her knew that justice had never truly been defeated. Even though death was closing in, Amara stood tall because she knew that in this moment, the truth would be exposed and everything would change. The viewers on the live stream flooded the screen with comments. Shouts, pleas, and messages about injustice filled the feed. She's telling the truth. Claire must be punished. Don't let them kill her. The words appeared endlessly, like a wave of support from millions of people standing by Amara. But in that instant, the assassin stepped forward, his footsteps crushing all the hope Amara had just ignited. Still, her scream didn't stop. It wasn't born of fear, but of resolve. She wouldn't let Lena's sacrifice be in vain. Amara collapsed, but Lena's smile, still visible in her memory, didn't fade. Even in the final moments, as death drew closer, she knew she had done something monumental. The truth had been spoken, and no one could erase that. The viewers couldn't look away from the screen, their emotions rising with each passing second. They felt not only the excruciating pain Amara was enduring, but they also saw the immense power of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. In those final moments of desperation, hope had been kindled, and the hearts of those watching couldn't help but be moved by her determination. Amara didn't die in despair. She had sparked a flame of hope for herself and for all those who believed in justice. In the days that followed, the world outside was no longer the same. Amara's live stream video, filled with desperation yet brimming with courage, spread like a powerful wave. Millions of people witnessed the brutality she had endured. And more importantly, they saw the truth that had been hidden for so long. Amara's screams, her accusations against Claire, sparked an awakening in a world that had been asleep. Public opinion was no longer silent. Immediately, protests erupted across the globe. From major cities to remote areas, thousands of people flooded the streets, demanding freedom for Amara, demanding justice for the suffering she had endured. Signs reading "Free Amara" and "Justice for Amara" became symbols of defiance against the deceivers and those who tried to bury the truth. The police, after a swift investigation, couldn't ignore the undeniable evidence. Claire, who had hired the assassin and used every method to crush Amara, could no longer escape punishment. In a raid on Claire's private residence, the police arrested her. And this time, she was no longer the powerful and arrogant figure she once was. Her eyes, as she was cuffed and let out of her house, revealed panic, fear, and a raw vulnerability. She had believed she could control everything, but once the truth came to light, all she was left with was her collapse. I can't," Claire trembled, trying to justify herself, but her words held no weight. The people who had once protected her now turned away, and the calls for justice from the public only deepened Claire's fear. The police took her right from her home, and this was the clearest sign of change, the victory of good and justice over corruption. Back in the prison, Amara sat in her cell, the feeling of despair still lingering in her heart. But as she heard the news, a sensation she had never felt before washed over her: happiness. Happiness because the truth had finally been revealed, because evil had been exposed and had begun to pay the price. As the shouts of prisoners echoed outside, Amara stood up, her back straightened and her eyes widened as she heard the news. "Claire's been arrested," she heard another prisoner shout. "She's been arrested. Justice has won." Amara couldn't control her emotions. She screamed, but this time not in pain. This was a scream of joy. Tears streamed down her face, but these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of triumph after so much suffering. She yelled out in joy, knowing that at last, she had not been abandoned. The battle she had fought in the dark, in isolation, had finally yielded results. Justice has won. Amara cried out, her voice echoing through the darkness of her cell. But this time, it wasn't a cry for help. It was a declaration of defiance against all the injustices, against everyone who had tried to crush her. She no longer felt like the loser. She had won, and the sacrifice of Lena, the courage of all those who had stood up for justice, had finally been rewarded. The blinding flashes of cameras, the clicking of lenses, and the cheers of the people surrounding her created a storm-like atmosphere around Amara. She stood in the center, her legs trembling, her body exhausted after the endless days in prison. But in this moment, she felt something she never thought possible: freedom. Everything around her seemed a blur. And all that mattered was this moment, the moment she had fought for through endless hardship. When the large prison door swung open and Amara stepped out, she could hardly believe her eyes. People were applauding, but nothing could make her forget the feeling she hadn't experienced in so long: freedom. Her steps were heavy, but every movement brought her closer to her son. And then there he was, Elijah, the little boy she had been ripped away from. He stood there, his eyes wide in surprise, but as soon as he recognized her, his face lit up like sunshine breaking through after a storm. Amara couldn't hold back the flood of emotions. She rushed toward him, arms outstretched, and in that fleeting moment, she enveloped him in a tight embrace. "Elijah," she cried out through her sobs, the voice of a mother reunited with her child after what felt like an eternity. The familiar scent of her son, the feeling of him in her arms, made all the pain and losses melt away. The world around her seemed to stop when Amara embraced her son, ignoring the cameras capturing every moment. She could feel her heart pounding. But this time, it was the beat of life, of rebirth, of a life she had long stopped daring to dream of. Tears streamed down her face, not from despair, but from joy, from liberation. The long months of suffering, the years in prison, the separation, all of it was now in the past. She had survived, and she had come back. Mark stood beside them, his eyes filled with tears. The husband she had lost during those painful months was now here, witnessing this moment. He stepped forward, wrapped his arms around Amara from behind, and together they held Elijah tightly. There were no words to describe the emotions they felt. The reunion, the rebirth of a family that had seemed lost forever, was now complete. Mark, in that moment, couldn't hold back his tears. "You're back," he whispered in her ear, his voice trembling with emotion. Amara couldn't say anything except through her choked sobs. She wasn't just crying for survival. She was crying for every day she fought to return to her son. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered. But this time, it wasn't an apology for the losses. It was a thank you for finally returning to her family. As the reporters began to ask questions, Amara glanced at them. But her gaze was fixed solely on her family. Everything had become clear. The truth had triumphed, and all she had to do now was begin anew. She had endured, but now she would live a life where justice, love, and reunion were all she truly deserved. This ending, though filled with painful memories from the past, had given Amara a new beginning. The audience couldn't help but be moved watching the bond between mother and child, the love between those who had endured countless trials to be together. In that moment, when all the pain seemed to vanish in the air, smile, it was the moment when good finally triumphed, and sacrifice had been rewarded as it should be. The courtroom was filled with a heavy tension as the final verdict was read. Claire stood there, clad in her prison uniform, her eyes filled with remorse, though she couldn't mask the overwhelming fear rising within her. The court had convicted Claire of slander, attempted murder, and incitement to hatred, grave crimes she had committed in her attempt to exact revenge on Amara and destroy her life. But it was over now, and justice had finally been served. Amara sat in the gallery, her hands clenched tightly, her heart pounding as she looked at Claire, the woman who had caused her so much pain. During the trial, she had struggled to stay composed. The horrible memories of her months in prison, the slaps, the false accusations, all seemed to flood back, nearly choking her. But this time, she didn't scream in despair. Her gaze now was one of resilience, strength, and determination. "She destroyed my life. She wanted to kill me. She killed my dreams," Amara shouted. But this time, it wasn't in weakness, it was with strength. She remembered everything Claire had done to her. But now, in this moment, she stood tall and had justice on her side. "She didn't just take my freedom. She took it from so many others. Justice will be restored." Amara's voice rang out, filling the courtroom, making everyone present feel the fury she had endured. The pain of the past could not be undone, but the truth had been spoken, and justice had been restored. Amara's resilience was a victory for all that was good, a reaffirmation that evil could not thrive forever. When the final sentence was announced, Amara stood up, her head held high, her eyes shining with hope, with belief in a future free from injustice. And as Claire was escorted out of the courtroom, the final shock hit her. A price had been paid for all her wrongdoings. Amara had reclaimed her right to live, her right to freedom, and her right to the justice she so richly deserved. Everyone in the courtroom stood as the final sentence was delivered. But no one realized that a new journey was just beginning for Amara. This victory was not only about clearing her name and gaining her freedom, but it was the start of a new life, a life where she would continue fighting, not only for herself, but for all those who had suffered injustice. As soon as the trial concluded, Mark stood beside Amara, taking her hand. And in a shocking decision, he announced his resignation as CEO of the airline. "It's time for a change," Mark said, his voice full of certainty. "Amara, you deserve to lead. You deserve to be in this position. I will never stand in your way again." Amara looked into Mark's eyes, her own filled with surprise, yet also trust. She stepped up to the podium, her steps firm as she addressed the crowd before her and made her own decision. "This airline will change. We will not allow anyone to suffer the injustice I endured. Every employee here, every customer, will always be treated fairly. No one will be left behind. No one will have their rights stripped away just because they are different." The applause erupted, a resounding affirmation that change had begun. With her heart full of passion and determination, Amara had not only reclaimed justice for herself, but had also opened a new path for others. In that moment, she realized that no matter how cruel the world could be, goodness could still prevail.